This video is going to provide guidance on Unit 5, Managing Project Schedules. This is going to go over the unit guide and explain the criteria to help you put together evidence for this unit. This unit is part of the SCQF Level 8 Diploma in Project Management awarded by EAL. In the unit guide, it describes schedule management as being the process of developing, maintaining and communicating schedules for time and resources. This unit sits at SCQF Level 8 and there's 13 credit values for this unit. This unit has 4 learning outcomes. The first is being able to develop schedules for project activities. This relates specifically to the planning stage, so planning out schedules and putting together a project schedule plan. The second outcome for this unit is being able to evaluate the schedule management methods used within a project and draw lessons for future projects. So that's a reflective piece on the techniques which have been used to develop the schedule plan. Outcome 3 is being able to present scheduling information to stakeholders. So that is about communication in the delivery stage. The project is then ongoing and you've got to communicate and update that schedule information to stakeholders. And outcome 4 is being able to monitor progress and revise schedules for project activities. So that is specifically to do with monitoring progress and identifying any deviations from the plan and then putting in corrective measures using the correct change control procedure. So let's look at the first outcome in the first criteria, 1.1. So it's confirm with stakeholders the levels of accuracy and detail required in the schedule for project activities and agree appropriate tolerances. So this is the first step in putting together a schedule management plan. And that is where you are engaging with stakeholders to identify how much accuracy and detail is required within the schedule management plan. It can also be the point where you're starting to identify via communication with stakeholders what activities have to be in place, and to some extent, or this is maybe moving on to later criteria that's going to be covered, the order in which they have to be done in. So it's about communicating with stakeholders to identify what they need out of the schedule management plan, how much detail they need, what information they need, how does it have to be laid out, what is their requirements for the schedule management plan. And you also want to agree appropriate tolerances. Tolerances about deviations. So you'll have a plan, you'll have a schedule plan with set durations and timelines. Plans always, everything doesn't go to plan, and there will always be some form of deviation. Minor deviations aren't an issue, so that's why you set tolerances of a couple of hours, a couple of days. It depends on your project, but if there is a deviation within those tolerances, it's not an issue. It's only if there's a deviation out with those tolerances that you'd do some form of investigation to see if corrective action is required. So that's what it means by tolerances, and that's something you want to set early on. Performance tasks, you want to reflect on the time where you were involved or contributed towards planning a project schedule. How did you confirm with stakeholders required detail? Who were the stakeholders that you communicated with? What was it you confirmed? What was the agreed tolerances, and how was this recorded or documented? Product evidence for this could be your communication with stakeholders, so any form of digital communication, letters, meeting minutes, that sort of thing. You've also got your business case or your schedule management plan with some detail about tolerances and about levels of accuracy and detail that's within that plan. 1.2 is analyse interdependencies between project activities using appropriate methods. So this is about identifying what tasks relate to other tasks in a network diagram. So it's potentially, if you have it the first stage, first of all it's a work breakdown structure where you're outlining the different levels and you're breaking the activities down into little steps, and then that will later, the next stage of that is to put it into a network diagram. So this is the initial part where you're putting it into that work breakdown structure, you're putting it in the right order, and you're working out which tasks are related, what tasks need to be done before the next task in order to move on to the next set of tasks. So for this one, reflect on a time where you're planning schedule. How did you develop individual work packages? How did you work out the order in which the tasks had to be completed, and how did you put this together using logic dependencies? So that is start, finish, that sort of thing, finish, start. What were the issues you had, and how did you document this? For product evidence, that could be a work breakdown structure or critical path analysis. 1.3 is estimate the time requirements and resource requirements, both consumable and reusable, of project activities. Determine the interrelationships between these requirements using an appropriate method. So this is now about estimating time requirements. This could be using PERT, for example. It could be using any other technique that you'll be using for your project. And you're wanting to outline You want to get evidence that shows you're able to estimate or contribute towards estimating, and you're able to attach those estimates to individual project activities and also work out those interrelationships between the requirements. So that is perhaps a network diagram or some other form of documenting the order in which tasks have to be completed. Falling into that is a critical path as well. So for performance tasks for this criteria, reflect on a time where you were planning schedule. What estimating method did you carry out? How did you estimate and record the requirements for each work activity? How did you estimate and record resource requirement for each work activity? And what method did you use to work out the interdependencies between time and resource requirements? Product evidence for this would be a resource histogram, a network diagram, a Gantt chart perhaps. It could be a spreadsheet of your estimating, doing calculations to estimate. Could be using your project management software if there's a tool on there that you would use to estimate time requirements. You can also look at your information management strategy or your knowledge database for your organisation to look at previous projects which have occurred, and maybe you would identify one of your estimate methods would be to look at similar previous projects and maybe make a change for accounting inflation, or if your project's more or less complicated, making adjustments to it. So there's different estimating techniques, and it'd be very good to outline this in your evidence, what technique that you used. And even if you worked on multiple projects where you've used different estimating techniques, then you can also, it's good to document that over time in your evidence. The other thing to be said is that estimate methods will change over time, and over time estimating becomes more accurate. So it might be you use different estimating techniques depending on the stage in the project life cycle that you're at. So early on, you're not going to get into a lot of detail because you might not go ahead with this project, but later on, it's very important to get that accuracy in the planning. 1.4, define and sequence the project activities, taking account of their interdependencies and using resource leveling or resource smoothing as appropriate to reconcile time and resource constraints. This is now you taking your work activities, you've estimated how long they're going to take, and you're actually putting it together into a network diagram. So this is the point where you're going from work breakdown structure to network diagram, and you're putting them into a correct sequence. You know their interdependencies, so you know the order they're going to be put into, and you're just putting them into that correct order and documenting it. You'd then be taking that network diagram and you'd be putting it into a Gantt chart, and attached to that Gantt chart would be a resource histogram. So if you're doing a holistic statement or you're doing some holistic evidence for this criteria, there is a link between this criteria and this outcome in general to the resource unit and the first outcome in there, which is about planning, project and resources. There's a bit of overlap because resource leveling, resource smoothing, well, that's resources. So the best practice would be to have some sort of holistic evidence that covers both these outcomes where possible. So you want to get, just to recap, work breakdown structure, network diagram, Gantt chart. Attached to Gantt chart, you've got your resource histogram, and then that way you can perform resource leveling and resource smoothing as appropriate for your project. So for performance tasks, reflect on a time where you're planning schedule. How did you define the sequence in which activities should be completed? How did you analyse interdependencies between the sequence which activities should be completed? So that could be logic dependencies. And how did you produce a Gantt chart? How did you adjust the schedule to level or smooth resources as required? For product evidence, this could be work breakdown structure, network diagram, critical path, Gantt chart, and resource histogram. Ideally all of them, if possible. 1.5, recognise the risks to project activities by applying management tools and techniques that are consistent with the nature of project activities, their scale and their complexity. So this is about the risks. So what risks are in the schedule? What could go wrong? What delays could potentially happen? There is overlap with this criteria and the risk management unit, which is another one of the optional units you might be doing, about identifying, prioritising and managing risks. So within the schedule, there's a lot of risks, a lot of things that can go wrong. So perhaps you put contingency into your schedule. So that's time where the schedule can go on without impacting overall length, deliberately having some slack in your schedule for any unforeseen risks or problems that might arise. But for this, you want to relate it to obviously the project you're working on and to say what risks did you identify within the schedule and what did you do to document this. So reflecting the time, planning schedule, how did you plan for risks, what methods did you use, how did you document it, what were the risks and what were the contingencies. Product evidence for this would be a risk analysis relating to schedule, maybe a probability impact grid, red, amber, green rag analysis, could have some contingency, and responsibilities. That's documentation, assigning responsibilities of certain tasks to people. Moving on now to the second outcome, which is about monitoring progress. So 2.1, establish a progress monitoring regime and metrics consistent with the nature of project activities, their scale and their complexity. So this is about, we're now moving on to project delivery stage. So outcome 1 is project planning, outcome 2 project delivery. So the project is now ongoing. There's always going to be some update and some deviation from the original schedule plan. And the only way to be able to identify that is to have an effective monitoring regime. So that is whatever method you're using within your project to monitor whether the project is meeting its schedule plan. Is it on time or is it over time? How do you identify that? What reporting methods you use? What techniques are you using? How are you communicating? Do you have any project management software that you're using? Do you have weekly progress calls? Who's on those calls? What's discussed? Is there a set format? Do you have maybe a PowerPoint that you share and you update certain areas of it that identifies whether things are on track or not? What is done for your project. So for this one, reflecting the time your monitoring schedule, what was the monitoring procedure for your project? How was that decided? How was it agreed? The tolerances, what tolerances were agreed? How is it documented? And how is this monitoring system consistent with the particulars of your project? Project evidence would be any sort of plan around, any documentation about the plan that's been put in place for monitoring schedule, any sort of reporting that's been done on project schedules. 2.2 is identifying departures from schedule using information from reports and from inquiry and establish the likely consequences for the project. So this one is quite simple, is that you're now you're actively identifying departures from the schedule using information from reports and inquiries. That is you then undertaking the plan that you set out for monitoring. So you've set out your plan, this is how I'm going to monitor it. You're actually doing that, and then you've identified the departure from the schedule. The second part of this criteria, which also has to be covered, is establish likely consequences for the project. So any sort of change to maybe one project activity has been delayed, that's going to have knock-on effect on the next activity. And you can see that from your network diagram or your Gantt chart, what that effect is going to be. That can also have an effect on the resources that's required to complete that activity, the finances. If things are having to move about, that will have an impact on quality as well. So it's going to have a knock-on effect, these things, and for this, not only do you need to identify that there's a departure, you need to be able to quickly identify what the knock-on effects are going to be for other aspects of your project. Product evidence for this would be report to highlight any deviations. 2.3, recommend and justify corrective actions for departures from schedule. So you've identified your departure, you've worked out what the consequences are. You need to come up then with a plan. So this is what this one's about, is time where you've come up with a plan to correct the deviation. So this is obviously best case is part of a holistic statement about a time you've identified a departure, and then now you're going into like this is corrective actions that are recommended. You want to justify them. Why was it that you picked those corrective actions? So reflecting the time where you're monitoring schedule, what was the cause of the departure? What was the contingency plan if one? What was the action or recommendation that you took, and what was the outcome? Product evidence would be communication, recommending corrective actions, risk and contingency plan for schedule management plan, or a screenshot report of departure being identified, or generally speaking any sort of documentation that's around recommending. So it could be communication, particularly communication with colleagues, and this is what I think would be the best solution. 2.4, make recommendations to the schedule in association with stakeholders and in compliance with formal change management processes. So there is a link here between scope management. It's a link between from this one to the scope management unit, and that is about change control. So if you are working on a change, then that is going to, if you write a holistic statement, that is going to move into that scope management unit and cover one of the outcomes here. It's about the change management process. So you've identified your departure, you've identified the consequences, you've identified what should be done to correct it. Now you're actually making those recommendations. You're communicating with stakeholders to make sure the changes are okay with them, and you're following that change control process to make sure that the documents are updated properly and everything is communicated out to stakeholders. So reflect the time where you're managing project schedule. What change requests did you receive? What is the change control process? How did you process that change control request and adhere to the procedure? What was the outcome? How did you revise documents? And how did you communicate changes to stakeholders? Product evidence would be any sort of documentation requesting the change, perhaps a section of your change control policy. Communication document following the change control process, communication with stakeholders, agreeing these activities and updating, a screenshot or documentation of you updating version control, compliance with change management processes, and actually updating the plan. So it might be that it's on a system, it might be your updating schedule on your project management system, in which case you can get product evidence from screenshots from that of you actually updating the plan. Moving on now to outcome 3, which is which is about communicating schedule information to stakeholders. So 3.1 is select presentation methods to suit the requirements of different stakeholders and the nature, scale and complexity of project activities. Now, presentation methods for this does not mean a PowerPoint presentation necessarily. Presentation methods just means the method that you're using to communicate schedule information to stakeholders, to other people. So that's all presentation methods mean. It doesn't have to be a PowerPoint presentation. It could be an email, it could be a Teams message, it could be putting something on SharePoint. It's just anything you're using to communicate that information to your stakeholders. So for this one, reflect the time you had to communicate schedule information. How did you communicate that information to relevant stakeholders, and the information, how is that relevant to your stakeholders? Did it have to be formatted in a certain way? So a strong overlap with this outcome and with the communications unit as well. So maybe have a look into that if you're writing holistic or you're putting together holistic evidence. What stakeholders had to be informed? What did you communicate to each stakeholder, and what method of communication did you use? Was the schedule changed or adapted to suit any particular stakeholders? Product evidence would be email, shared drives, WebEx, Teams, Slack, Skype, or any other collaborative technology. So that is just different examples of technology you could be using to communicate, and any sort of screenshot or any documentation form that could be used as product evidence. 3.2 Apply selected methods to ensure that stakeholders comprehend the information needed to discharge the responsibilities associated with their role. So you're wanting to ensure that the information you're communicating to stakeholders to be able to discharge or complete their role is accurate and is in the right format and sent to them in the right time. So again, there's a strong overlap with the communications unit. There's an outcome in this that's very similar. Obviously, if you're writing statements or you're putting evidence together that's on send out information to do with schedule, you'll be able to do holistic evidence across both units. And again, this one is specifically about making sure that information is formatted, it's sent to them, you form that communications plan, and you'll be able to send that information. So for example, maybe there's an engineer who's responsible for putting together some equipment. They need to know when that equipment's due, what order things need to be done, and how long they've got to complete each task. So that information needs to be sent to them in a way that they'll understand it, in a way that they'll receive. Product evidence would be sort of communication documents, reports around this. The last outcome for this unit, 4.1, evaluate alternative methods for those used within the project for determining interdependencies, planning schedules, managing changes, analysing risk, monitoring activities, including a choice of metrics, and determining time and resource requirements. So 4.1 is a list. There's a lot of different points on the list, and it's important that all of these points are covered. It doesn't have to be, this can be done as a standalone piece of evidence where you're evaluating and reflecting on methods that you use for each of these list items, or it could be added in holistically to a statement. So if you're doing a holistic statement on planning schedules, if within that statement you evaluate your alternative methods that could have been used for planning schedule, you could map that evidence in to just that list item, planning schedules, and then maybe you're writing a holistic statement on a time you're analysing risk for your schedule, and in that that's other statement that's on analysing risk, you've discussed and evaluated alternative methods for analysing risk. Well, then that would come in and that would tick in and map into that analysing risk. It's important that all the list items are covered. You can't just cover one or two list items. All list items in that list have to be covered. So for each of these things that are in the list, reflect on your experience of managing the project schedule. For each of the listed areas, what were the techniques which you used, what worked well and what could have worked better, and other techniques which you could have used. Product evidence would be a review document, reflective document. Most of the time for this one, because it's evaluate alternative methods, it's going to be a statement or a discussion, something that you as a learner are doing because it's about your evaluation, but there is potential that product evidence could be used. So that concludes the guidance for this unit, so I hope that helps putting together evidence.